I'm going to talk today, like MTL said, and try and bring this all together. How do we really link our understanding of drought and drought indices to the ecological impacts that we care about, so we can start thinking about planning for them and managing them? And so I just wanted to go back to what Wynn was talking about how maybe an individual plant might respond to drought conditions, and just put out the idea there that, you know, ecologically available water and how water is available to the critters or the plants that we care about is really diverse and variable. Each species has different kinds of traits and different ways of approaching their environment that allow them to deal with drought in different ways. So we have to kind of keep that in mind with ecosystems, that these different drought indices, you know, may represent different aspects of the water cycle. So here on the right, I'm showing a graphic that's trying to map, you know, the standardized precipitation index is talking about precipitation, and the FDSI is trying to integrate soil moisture and precipitation, and EDDI is all about evaporative demand, and so forth. So these different drought indices are representing different parts of the water cycle. And you may have to just do some thinking about the ecological, you know, target that you focus on, to think about, well, would they be really responsive to atmospheric, you know, really dry atmospheres? Or is it more about soil moisture? Or is it more about, you know, the runoff that maintains wetlands, that maintains, you know, amphibians? So these are the kind of questions that as ecologists we need to ask. I want to go through just one case study example to show you how I did this for an ecological drought in the southwestern corner of Montana. And what we really wanted to do was focus on a very severe drought that happened in the past, in the early 2000s. There was severe drought for about 6 years in this area. And we did a lot of work with stakeholders in the region who were creating drought plans for each one of these watersheds. I've labeled 8 different watersheds. These are at the Huck 8 scale. And so we wanted to contribute to their drought planning effort by asking questions about how the ecosystem was vulnerable to a past drought. And we focused on forests in this particular case. And what we wanted to do was bring together the ecological drought framework that Wynn introduced to you, and sort of ask questions about, why did we see this ecological impact that we saw in the past? And can we attribute what really, you know, why that system was vulnerable to drought conditions? And so we're trying to gather together data for each one of these icons here, so that we can represent an ecological drought vulnerability analysis and help prepare for planning. So the first thing we wanted to do is come up with a data layer that represented that ecological impact. We did a lot of outreach with stakeholders in each of these watersheds. Forest was one of the top ecological concerns they had during droughts. So that's what we focused on. This is work led by Megan Halabisky and others that looks at the trend in forest health over this 6-year-long drought period. This is using NDVI data from Landsat. The red areas show you where there were substantial losses of tree health during this time period, and essentially tree mortality. So then we wanted to think about, okay, what were the drought conditions during this drought? And we wanted to try and separate different aspects of the water cycle. So what we used was EDDI to represent the evaporative demand. Larry, you haven't heard about EDDI's friend Larry, but Larry is the Landscape Evaporative Response Index. And Larry sort of gives us a feel for the combination of evapotranspiration and evaporation, and is in some ways a proxy for soil moisture. We also use the standardized precipitation index to focus on rainfall in particular, and then snow water equivalent, which isn't really a drought index, but we can use it in our data to understand that aspect of potential snow drought conditions. We also considered landscape characteristics. So we looked at aridity, like MTL's talked about, how wet or dry a landscape actually is, and we measured that by climatic water deficit over a 30-year mean. We also looked at heat loading index, slope, topographic position index, topographic water index, aspect. These guys that are grayed out just weren't very important in our analysis. So when I show you the real data, you won't see them. We also considered ecological characteristics. So what were the vegetation types in this area? What's the percentage of canopy cover? What was the time since the last fire? We also considered vegetation height, canopy connectivity, trying to understand more about forest activity, recent management in these areas. So we used machine learning techniques, boosted regression trees to model each one of these Huck 8 level watersheds separately and ask the question, and I'm putting the map here just to remind you in the upper right, what caused the vulnerability of these forests, in this spatial configuration to drought conditions. So here I'm showing you the relative influence of each one of those variables that I put into this model. And all of the blue ones are drought indices. Representing those drought conditions. So again, EDDI represents atmospheric demand, evaporative demand. SPEI is just precipitation, and SWE is snow water equivalent, and then LARI, that proxy for soil moisture. Then we have our landscape variables. This is CWD, which is that aridity layer. Chile is a heat loading index, and then the percent slope. The green guys are showing you the ecological characteristics and the relative influence of those variables. This is canopy cover, the vegetation type, and the time since fire. Okay, so that's how you sort of read this graph. But if you pan out, you can just see, first of all, the drought indices really are very important. But some of the landscape variables and some of the ecological variables are also important. But I can look at each watershed one at a time, and what emerges is that some watersheds show different patterns from others. So our really high elevation watersheds, the most important variable in driving that spatial pattern of tree, poor tree health, was the snow water equivalent. So these are sort of snowpack driven droughts, snow droughts. But and sorry, these little flower pots, the bigger the petal, it's the most, that is telling you which variable was most important in the model. So SWE was most important in these models, but also you can see that landscape variable, which in this case was the aridity, the 30-year mean of CWD, was also really important. But I can go to some lower elevation watersheds, and now all of a sudden the importance of these drought indices changes quite substantially. And now EDDI is the most important drought index for trying to understand those ecological impacts on the ground. And you can also see here that one of the green petals is also really long. This is the percent canopy cover in these watersheds. So you can see how these things really vary across space and across the kind of ecosystem that you're thinking about. I want to just unpack the canopy cover a little bit because it showcases how there can be interactions between drought conditions and those ecological characteristics or landscape characteristics that we focus on. So this graph is showing the role of canopy cover as we increase in percentage into the likelihood of having a drought response of poor tree health on the ground. And you can see this is a pretty clear relationship where the more canopy cover you have, the more likely you are to have a drought response. And this is because these trees are competing for water during drought conditions, right? But what's interesting is that you can, in your multivariate modeling space, try and understand, well, how does canopy cover actually interact with the drought index? In this case, the standardized precipitation index. And here, what we're showing in the bright yellow areas, this is where the likelihood of drought response is really high. So we know it's where canopy cover is high, but it's also where the SPEI is negative when we're in drought conditions. This is the sweet spot, so to speak, of where we're going to see ecological impacts. This is an example of how if you were just looking at that drought index alone, you would really miss a lot of the important features of how ecological drought manifests on the landscape. Here's another example of snow water equivalent interacting with the kind of vegetation to show the likelihood of drought response. So here we see that aspen are much more likely to experience some drought impacts, or perhaps Douglas fir during these times of low snowpack. So I want to just leave you with the idea that there is no one size fits all drought index for eco-drought. You really have to think about your organism and how it needs water, how it uses water. And just to realize that there is so much spatial variation during any one drought. There may also be variation across droughts in terms of how the meteorological conditions manifest. So it's really important for us to always think about what drought index might be best for our system. But even when we do that, just a reminder, it's not that simple. Even if you find that best drought index like EDDI for low elevation forests, there's still more that's going on. There's still more interaction that might happen. But I do want to point out that those drought conditions really still are most important. So we're glad you're here to learn about drought indices. And with that, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Shelley. That's great. I think there was one question. I think clarification is what indicators did you use to assess ecological impact? And was it NDVI from Landsat? Was there something else?
It was just the trend in NDVI from Landsat over the period of the drought. And there are so many ways we could have done this. And we could have taken the difference in NDVI. We could have looked at EDDI. We settled on this one technique, and we think it performed pretty well. But yeah, there's a bunch of ways you could look at this.
Yeah, I also want to read a comment from Sean Finn that kind of relates to what Bill asked earlier about drying out and wetting. So he's talking about, he mentions like management strategies should focus on slowing the drying out functions when soil are moist. And that could impart resistance to systems if we can promote a slower drying out process on the ecosystem. And that kind of relates to something that you were talking about with Canopy and plant density kind of thing.
Yeah, and Sean, what it makes me think of is some of these adaptation strategies in that area in Montana where folks are considering things like beaver dam analogs or some kind of beaver mimicry to try and keep water on the landscape longer. We were really interested in seeing these areas where snowpack was an important driver. And what we wanted to think about was, okay, can understanding those aspects and how it's playing out across the landscape lead us to think of some more effective strategies, like can the kind of work we do there that says, oh, snowpack is a really big deal here, are those places where we could be more successful at beaver mimicry, for example. So yeah, it's really exciting to think about once you understand the specifics of how eco-drought manifests, then you can start thinking about some adaptation strategies.
Yeah, perhaps have time for one more question or a comment before we get into our break. Well, Shelley and Wilton brought us back on time. And so why don't we take a 10-minute break at this time as planned,